Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about mistakes to avoid before you even get started with SharePoint. Now, it might be the case that you're already in SharePoint and you're looking for maybe a few pointers. So this could also be helpful for you too. Now, what happens when SharePoint goes wrong? Well, it's going to come back and bite you, and it's going to cost you more to fix it then than if you think about it right from the start. Now, I'm joined today with my colleague, Ben. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Rupert.
Ben has been working with SharePoint for 15 plus years, so he's seen all of these things multiple times before. And my role as client director, well, I've seen quite a few of these things as well. So let's move on and let's talk about who today is targeted at. So this is for you if you're maybe in a management role, IT leader, team lead, maybe you have some responsibility over SharePoint, and maybe you're planning your journey and thinking, well, how do I get this right? Or maybe you're frustrated that SharePoint isn't quite doing what you want it to do, and maybe looking for some points of, well, if I'd done X, maybe this would be useful. Now, that's the backstory, Ben. What are the takeaways from today? What are people going to get out if they tune in today?
Yeah, so the key takeaways for today are that hopefully you'll come away from this understanding what those key issues are and how you can avoid them. And ultimately, that's going to help you set yourself up for a successful start in SharePoint. And yeah.
Okay, so if that's where we're going to get to, what are we trying to avoid? What are the biggest challenges? And I know, I hear it over and over again on the calls that I join that when people first call me, it's like the problem is people can't find what they're looking for. They know it's in there somewhere, and when they do find it, they're not confident that what they have found is the current version. And what ends up happening? They go back to the person who is the author and say, "Hey, can you please point me in this direction?" You set that person off, and then they're distracted, or you start going back to email, and people get frustrated with SharePoint. And then this other side of it, where SharePoint feels chaotic. There's teams, there's sites everywhere, there's buckets for everything, and people aren't sure where to find stuff, and also aren't sure where to save stuff. And then from a sort of administration perspective, people are struggling to say, well, what do we need to keep? What do we need to delete? What's important? What's not? And the whole thing's got a bit out of control, hasn't it? Then, I mean, that's what I hear when people start to call us. And I thought maybe today would be a really good idea to go into what are the causes of that? How did we get here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as you really highlighted, those are the two really key things. People struggle to find stuff. It's SharePoint's a bit of a mess, and ultimately it's about not sort of preparing your rollout appropriately. And hopefully, what we're going to be showing is some of those mistakes and how you can mitigate them so that you're setting yourself up for success. So let's have a look at the first one, shall we, Rupert? I think.
Yeah. So purpose. I mean, this is a really interesting one. When first speak to somebody, I say, well, look, we want to roll out SharePoint. We want to use SharePoint. And I'm like, what for? Because SharePoint's a platform, it's technology. It can do lots of different things. Ben, what do you hear first when someone says we're looking for SharePoint?
Yeah, so I think this is the challenging one really, which is you really need to understand what your primary motivations are for moving to SharePoint. Now, the reality is that in a lot of cases, this is going to be driven from IT, and probably it's going to be we need to move away from our file shares because we need to, perhaps some of the file servers are becoming end of life. It's difficult to maintain them, and also, we've invested in this Microsoft 365 platform for email and Office desktop applications, and we want to make the most of the tools that we have. So it is very much often an IT-led initiative, but really the key point about this is that we need to bring in the wider business and really understand from a business perspective what it is that SharePoint can do and what we want it to do for us. So what we're going to do is just bring up a few examples of what can SharePoint actually do, so we're thinking about what are the use cases we're going to be addressing.
Yeah, and I think the key thing about all of these, when I look at these, they're all content driven, which is what SharePoint is. It's a great content management system. So whether that's contracts, which you're looking to file and maybe get access at a future point, whether you're trying to manage a sales deal through the life cycle, or that more formal side of policy management where you've got approvals, these are all separate use cases. And I think within each of these is nuance as well, Ben. And I think it might be worth just diving into intranets, because someone says, I want an intranet. Well, it's not quite so simple as that, is it? There's a bit more to it than that.
Yeah, exactly. Even when we think about intranets, I kind of see that an intranet has two core purposes. One is to help you support employee engagement, and the other is to help you support employee productivity. The balance and the need for one versus the other, or a combination of the two, really depends on the organization that you are. So if you're an organization that's perhaps relatively small and everyone comes into the same office every day, then the engagement side of it is going to be less important. So instead, it's going to be more of a focus on productivity. Likewise, if you're a large global organization with lots of different regions and locations, then engagement is going to be really, really key as well. So understanding in that scenario what your purpose is going to be, across all of these use cases is really key to set you up in the right way.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't just have to be one purpose. We often take on projects with multiple streams which solve multiple problems at the same time. So don't feel like you have to lock into one. And it can very much be, well, actually, this is our collaboration platform, and this is where we want to manage our projects, for example. But moving on to Ben, when people thinking, well, I'm coming from a P drive, an S drive, a file server, or maybe even Dropbox or another cloud service, a lot of times, and this is particularly big, if you go back to the pandemic, where people lifted and shifted en masse everything from that file server into SharePoint and thinking, well, if I do that, I can then give my team OneDrive, they can sync that folder back down again. User experience, not a huge amount of change. New platform, I'm in the cloud, I can work from anywhere. Why is migrating from a file server, as is, shall we say, such a challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest challenge here is when you take that approach of migrate everything into a single SharePoint document library and set up folders and permissions, and maybe even worse, actually simply lift and shift your permission structure all the way into SharePoint as well. And that is going to cause you lots of problems because ultimately SharePoint is not a file server. It doesn't work in the same way, and you're going to have lots of issues around performance. You're not going to be able to benefit from the things that SharePoint actually gives you, such as metadata. You're not going to be able to archive data at the end of a project, for instance. And the reality is that SharePoint storage is more expensive generally than file storage. So you really want to be optimizing it and getting it, getting the most out of it, really. So I think, as we said, SharePoint is not a file server. So again, it's just worth looking at what actually is it.
Okay, so I mean, we've got some very high level categories here, and these apply to the purpose if you think about it. So number one, if we're thinking from a file server, we've now moved to a collaboration solution. What does that mean? Multiple people coming together to work typically on the same content or trying to achieve a common purpose. So we now bring in things like multiple people editing a single document. We're no longer going to see that sign which says this file's been locked, notify. I think you all remember that from the file server days. But also that means things like app mentions, but changing behaviors. So how do we get people to start thinking through the browser rather than emailing files, for example? The next bit is it does give you that formal side of document management as well. So when you think maybe you have a contract, you need to keep it for a number of years, you can put on retention policy around that. When you need to lock documents down, or maybe at the end of a period, maybe you've had a CV for a job role and they weren't successful, making sure that documents get deleted maybe after 6 months if that's what the rules are. So you've got that more formal side of filing, and really this is where a lot of value of metadata comes in. And then in the third category, SharePoint's a publishing platform as well. So it's rather than files, you're dealing with web pages. So this is where your intranet or your portal might come to play, or maybe your knowledge base where we're creating content with it within the browser. And again, a different way of creating content. And then the final bit which we got here is using that data in SharePoint as effectively your database for your Power Apps or your Power Automate flows. So you've got that maybe list of customers which you want to reference over and over again, but you've got to manage them in a platform that you can control. So it does quite a few things there, doesn't it, Ben?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really does. But I think you've picked up on a couple of points here. I mean, we've got collaboration, we've got filing, we've got publishing platforms. So I think that kind of leads us into the next issue quite nicely.
Yeah, and actually, I was speaking to someone yesterday about this sort of confusion between collaboration and publishing. And to be, pretty clear, collaboration is the bit where we work together, maybe a small group of people. Publishing is when we want to access it, publish it out to the audience, all our staff. a great example of this might be a policy. You're working on your annual leave policy. It goes through some internal conversations, review process, and then you publish it. And often, how many people can say they go into their file store and say, this is the version of a document I can trust and reference, and this is the one which I haven't finished yet or haven't published yet. And what we're trying to do is untangle that. And there's a different part of a document lifecycle, but there's also been, I think, different permission set as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think, actually, again, a lot of this comes from, maybe the legacy of working in a file share environment, which is, traditionally you might say, let's take HR, for example. Traditionally, you might see a HR parent folder, and then within it, you've got a private area, which is where you're going to keep your employee records and your salary control sheets and payroll, etc. And then you might see a public area, which is made available to everyone else, which has got the policies and the benefits packages and all that kind of information. So in a file share, yeah, that's fine. But realistically, when we think about SharePoint and we're thinking of those public and private scenarios, really we need to be using the right tools for the job, the right type of site template, for instance. So again, if we have a look at those scenarios a little bit closer, as we said, when we're thinking about publishing, we're talking about things like news, knowledge, policy information that we're going to make available to a large group of people in the organization. Filing, we're looking at contracts, employee records, financial statements, for instance, things that we need to keep in an organized way that we might need to refer back to at a later date. And then collaboration is stuff that we're kind of doing in the moment. We're working on it right now, our drafts, we might be working in a department or a project, or maybe across a particular business process in your value chain, for example. So I think with that, what might be worth doing is just doing a quick demonstration of how that might look like in a SharePoint environment.
Perfect. Well, if you want to steer me, Ben, and you take us through the key points.
All right, good stuff. So what we can see here is our sort of intranet landing page, and I think we're going to use that HR scenario as an example here. So Rupert, would you mind navigating over to our workspaces hub, where we're going to look at what a sort of private HR workspace looks like?
And just so for a bit of background, in this example, we've created 3 hubs. A hub is a collection of sites. Our intranet hub is where we have our publishing. Our projects hub is where our project work gets done, if you like. And our workspaces hub is where we find our sites for our support functions like HR and payroll.
Exactly. So yeah, let's just jump into the HR site there. So yeah, so what we can see here, we've got our HR site. We've sort of tailored this to do what it is that we needed to do. We've sort of configured it so it's relevant for our organization. And the way we've approached that, we've got our working documents area for our collaboration. That is actually linked to a Microsoft team, and we can see that because of the little Teams icon next to the HR site link there. We also have our employee records area. This is where we're going to organize all of our things like employee contracts, proof of eligibility to work, identification, all that kind of stuff. We've created a CV submissions library that we might want to receive from external people, where we're going to organize and manage those CVs during that hiring process. But the key thing around this is that this is all quite private, sensitive information, and we're using this team site structure to file and collaborate within our HR team appropriately. Let's switch over to our HR public facing area on our intranet, which in fact we've called people in this case, and that's quite common. You might have a HR team, but then your intranet area might be people, for example.
Okay.
So we're going to go to our people site here. And so what we can see here,
let's give that a second to come through. There we go.
Yeah, so what we can see here is that kind of information that we'd think very much in that public scenario. So, things like useful links and tools that our end users need to access, where to come to HR if you need a question, links to those key topics that you want to find out about, what's the process if I want to request leave, information for new starters, and of course, news and updates that are going to come from the people team. So again, traditionally stuff that might live within that public space within a HR subfolder, but now we've actually created a dedicated communication site for it. So I think the key thing we're really highlighting here is, instead of thinking HR and department first and then private public, we're thinking the other way around. We're creating an entirely separate publishing space from our collaboration space, and it means it's much less likely that we might accidentally drop a file in the wrong place and suddenly find that the salary control spreadsheet's been made available to everyone, for example.
And that goes back to that point at the top, where actually on the intro slide we talk about trust, and you've got to have trust in the security of your platform in SharePoint. Otherwise, people aren't going to use it. They're going to be terrified that if they put something in there, the wrong people might be able to see it. So, and that becomes actually more prevalent, not in this scenario, Ben, but maybe where you're externally sharing and you're maybe collaborating with a third party. So yeah, some considerations there. So if that is the content strategy, how do we take control of this, Ben? How do we make sure that everything is working consistently and we've got that control over SharePoint?
Yeah, so let's just switch back to the slides a minute. So yeah, that really leads into the next common challenge that we see, which is delaying or maybe even avoiding governance, right? So, just a quick statement. Generally, when you get access to SharePoint, by default, everything is open. Anyone can create a site, anyone can create a Microsoft team. And what you end up with, if you don't put some controls in place, is this problem with thousands of team sites that are all doing sort of the same thing. Some of them have got data in. Maybe at some point the owner of one has left the organization. We don't know who's responsible for it, etc., etc. So that can turn into a bit of a mess. So when we think about IT governance, often we're thinking purely a technical thing about turning things off. But really what we're trying to do is align everything back to our purpose that we've defined, and making sure that people have got the right tools to be able to do what they need to do. If they want to create a project, they can do it, but they're not going to run the risk of doing something by accident. So we've got this sort of analogy that we use here, a very simple analogy, which is really sort of good SharePoint governance. It's kind of like having those guardrails on a cliff top footpath, right? So you've got the absolute freedom to move back and forth and around in that footpath and enjoy the lovely view, but you're not going to accidentally fall off the side of the cliff. Okay, so we're trying to protect ourselves so that we can get the best benefit of the tools and the things that are there, but without making a mistake that's going to really, cause us a problem.
Okay. And so, when we think about governance, Ben, what does that mean maybe in a security perspective when we think about things like maybe permissions?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of security protector, it could mean a number of things. I think one of the things that we try and focus on when it comes to SharePoint is keeping your security, your permissions relatively simple. So instead of having lots of nested subfolders and broken down permissions in that way, we really want to keep our permissions managed at a site level. Now, that's still going to have a role to play with IT in terms of how they manage that. And of course, the other big thing that comes into this is about sharing externally. So you may want to enable certain areas that can share with external partners, for instance, and then other areas that are a bit more restricted because the sensitivity of the data means that it needs to be more protected.
Okay. Now, let's take another sort of different view of governance. And this is I guess, the next key point which I wanted to cover, which was this creativeness over consistency. And what I mean by that is SharePoint gives you a lot more flexibility, and increasingly so with flexible web parts, to create your sites, your pages, and make them very much, should we say, your own. And I think and nobody using analogies, but right now, if I go into PowerPoint, I know there's 100 different templates there, but as an employee, I always use the corporate one because that's how we like things laid out. And actually, the brand comes second to what we're trying to communicate in terms of message. But yeah, I think what I see in SharePoint is that kind of goes away a bit and says, this is your site, go and create what you wish. Is that the right balance? I think obviously I kind of teed the question up here a little bit, Ben, but where does that go wrong?
Yeah, it's a loaded question, isn't it? So I think, before I answer that, I think if we look back at that previous point about governance, ultimately what we're trying to do is create consistency here. So if we think within our governance plan, we've decided that these are the use cases for SharePoint. We're going to use Teams for projects. We're going to have permissions in this way, and we're going to, have department sites and then these intranet sites, for instance. So what we really want to be looking at doing is templating that so that, for instance, a project manager doesn't have to go and set up each project from scratch every time, or find that one project to another is structured in a completely different way. But when we start taking this to the sort of perspective of the intranet, I think exactly as Rupert's saying here, if you listen to the Microsoft marketing, a lot of the focus is on creating these sort of beautiful looking SharePoint pages and beautiful looking SharePoint sites that are really flexible and can almost sort of allow you to express your creativity. The reality is that SharePoint, SharePoint is not a tool for helping you express your creativity. That's not what its purpose is. SharePoint is a tool to help you provide information to those consumers, those end users. So you really need to be thinking about their needs. It's not about trying to create lots of individual sites that all can showcase their skills and their creativity. It's about creating something so that when those end users go from one site to another, there's that level of consistency that they're not going to have to relearn how this site works versus that. I know that if I go to this area, I've got the information that I need to see, the information you want me to see, etc. So again, I think this might be a good example where we flip back to the demo and have a look at what that means in reality.
Okay, so yeah, Ben, back here in the people site here where you left us.
Yep,
Where do you want
good
to go from here?
stuff. So yeah, I think, as we said, the point about this, we look at this particular people site within our intranet homepage, and as you can see, we've got on the right hand side, we've got those useful links. We've got the links to be able to contact HR if we need more information. We've got the news information that we need, which is sort of front and center. And we use a bit of a terminology when we're looking at our intranets, which is, what is the information that I need as an employee? What is the information that you need as a HR professional that you need me to see? And then what is the information that you would like to promote to me? And so what we can do is target these things in the appropriate place. So the stuff that I need is really easy to access in those useful links. You're promoting to me those key things like news stories that you'd like me to see. And you've got those calls to action, which are going to promote those key things that you want me or need me to be able to see. So that's great. But if we go and have a look at the IT site, what we'll hopefully see is that it's following the same pattern.
So yeah, coming to the IT site, what I'm seeing here is different content, but exactly the same layout. That is, that's pretty cool from a user perspective. And I guess if I go to, like a news website, I expect the same, right? I expect a certain layout whether I'm in the business section, the politics section, or the current affairs section. You have the same structure, and so then you tend to focus more on the content rather than where do I find the next click.
That's right.
And this works intra perspective. What about when we're thinking about maybe projects, for example?
Yeah, exactly. And why don't we have a quick look at that? If we jump over to our projects hub a minute, as I was saying earlier, that also applies. We want those standard project templates so a project manager doesn't have to set it up every time. So what we can see on the screen here is we've got a list of projects. We're going to go and click on that first project. And what we will see is that project site has been set up with the key lists and libraries. I can get to the information that I need, maybe those things like risk logs and all those types of bits that I can get to if I need to. So again, it's been consistently set up. So as I go from one project to another, I can feel confident that each project has got the right information for me.
And I think if you're maybe a project manager or somebody who works in projects, and there's a few projects, it could be, clients, for example, or matters if you're in legal, but you want to spend less time learning about the site and more just time just getting to the documents. And so let's say you are that project manager and you want to go from one risk register to the next, you know where to find it and you know it's got a consistent layout. So Ben, having templates seems a really sensible idea. To what extent does SharePoint support templating?
So this is where there are some gaps. So SharePoint provides you some out-of-the-box templates for sure. I very much see those out-of-the-box templates really as sort of demonstrations of how you could organize something. If you happen to find a template that exactly fits your purpose, then that's great. But most of the time, they're positioned as sort of showcases of how you could assemble your own site. There is no out-of-the-box functionality at this point in time that allows you to configure in the user interface a site how you want it, and then save it as a template so that you can easily reuse it. So realistically, that's where companies like ourselves have to step in to help our clients by putting frameworks in place that can achieve the same thing. So instead of having to worry about building a site from scratch, you can put a request into IT, or you can put a request into a self-service portal, and it's going to spin up that template for you in exactly the right way, in a consistent way.
And I guess you've got a degree of flexibility there. For example, you might have a complex project template and a simple project template, and choosing the right template at the right time would help you, create the site you need with that level of consistency, but of the right scale.
Yeah, I mean,
And I guess,
just to
oh,
well, just to add another point to that as well. I mean, a common thing that we see, and we can see in our portal there, is that, or we were able to see in our portal, is that in some cases it's even a case of saying that one type of site becomes another type of site. So maybe the project area starts off as a bid or an RFP response, but then if you win that project, then it expands into another type of site. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that
okay.
we're helping with.
So you're saying that we start with a site which is maybe called a bid site. You win that bid or that tender. We then create some additional, workspaces or areas within that, maybe to start managing risks, maybe new document library and standard folders. So I've got that structure, and we can right size it rather than having to copy data from A to B.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. And I guess this comes back to the previous point around governance, is where we put some control around if someone says, create a new marketing site, and there's already one called, marketing events. Do we need another one called marketing campaigns? And I guess that's that point where someone can say, well, hold on, let me question this a bit further, because
Mhm.
it's much easier, I think, Ben, if you stop people before they create something rather than try and mop up afterwards, when then you suddenly got files across two areas and you're trying to work out how to put them back together again.
Yeah, just give someone that sort of 30 seconds or so to think again about why they need something, as opposed to that kind of automatic, I'm just going to spin up a site for this. Yeah, it's just putting that little bit of thought process in front to then second guess and think, oh, actually, maybe I might go and contact that person and see if that site covers what we need.
Okay, so let's go, given that, let's go on to the next point. And, we talked about users there, and let's focus on, you've created this great SharePoint environment, and now we're thinking about the training of people. I mean, do I need to train people to use an intranet? Do I need to train people to use a document management system?
Yeah, I think this is a good point. So, in there's a school of thought where you could say, well, SharePoint's a website. You don't have to train people to use the BBC website, for example. And yes, I think if you're rolling out an intranet, then the intranet should be organized and presented in such a way that you don't have to provide end user training. Because it should be intuitive, that people can navigate around and find the things that they need to find relatively easily. But when it comes to that sort of file management, filing and collaboration scenarios, yeah, it's more of a tool that people need to use. So you do need to be factoring in your training for your end users. The reality is that within your organization, you are already going to have different levels of experience and knowledge with respect to SharePoint. Some people may be more curious, maybe have already spun up a few sites and you're not even aware of it. Some people may have come from a previous organization that used SharePoint in the past, and they might even have a good or perhaps a negative perception of it and how it works. So what you really need to do is make sure that all of your users have got the same core skills. They all know how to share documents instead of emailing them. They all know how to co-author documents and work on them and use the modern comment functionality, for instance, to get that productivity saving. They all need to understand how to use the recycle bin, or how to access version history if they need to recover something. And they need to be able to sync things so that they can access intuitively from their local devices. So everyone should be provided that base level of knowledge, and we've listed out some of those scenarios there, which I'm not quite sure is the right slide, but yeah, so we've just listed out some of those scenarios there. in terms of what people need to be able to do.
Yeah, I think let's pull out a couple of those. So if you've come from a file server, you're not going to be used to version history. You're going to be using file naming instead. You're going to be used to emailing documents maybe rather than sharing the links. And then you bring in new features which you haven't had before, like co-authoring comments and mentions. I know a lot of organizations start with thinking through OneDrive, but then there's still quite a lot of potential there. So getting everyone up to the same level, absolutely key. And Ben, when we're planning a launch of SharePoint for document management, what are some of the steps that we're thinking about, if I took it week by week?
Yeah, I think so. We put an example timeline here, and ultimately what we're thinking about is in most cases, you're gearing up to a migration from your file shares. So you need to be thinking about that migration weekend itself and planning backwards from it. So, we would generally recommend that, at least 4 weeks in advance, you're putting that comms out to your end users to say, this is coming, and we are scheduling our training sessions to make sure that everyone is going to be trained within a 2-week window prior to them being affected by this migration. So there's no point training people 4 months, 4 months beforehand, or just waiting until after you've sort of thrust this tool on them. Making sure that they're being trained at the appropriate time. And if you're running multiple waves of migration, again, scheduling the right people at the right time. So we recommend 2 weeks in preparation up to that migration weekend, so that that when everyone comes back to work on the Monday, they know exactly where to go and find their information, and they know how to use these tools to get the most out of it from day one.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we touched on with the last box there is refresher videos. So creating video shorts of common tasks, maybe things that you might not do every day, but maybe every 3 months, like work through a policy approval. That's particularly useful because I kind of know how to do it, but if someone could just remind me, I can get back on track. And obviously, in any organization, more and more, some people have had experience with SharePoint, in a previous role, or maybe, and so bringing people up to the same level is key. Now, Ben, adoption tends to mark the end of a project, and the SharePoint team's then rolling off. But then I see the risk is that SharePoint starts to go, south. How do I keep it as good on launch day, 12 months down the line?
Yeah, exactly. I think, it's such a good point, because the reality is that you've mobilized this big project team, you've rolled SharePoint out, and after that point, you sort of lose some of that momentum. The project team will move on to work on the next thing, and it's quite easy a year down the line to find that some of those behaviors that you spent time encouraging people to use are falling by the wayside a little bit. So really you need to be setting yourselves up to success and making sure that you're able to sort of reinforce and continue and promote and get the most out of that investment that you've made. So the way we kind of look at this is, yes, the obvious thing is you need to be set up to be able to react to problems. That's kind of obvious. Your first line support team need to be aware post migration of the kind of problems that they're going to face. Ideally you have some expertise that you're able to call out on, to be able to resolve more technical or difficult issues that, it's the kind of thing that we can provide, for example. But it's not just about reactive. You also need to be thinking about what can you plan to do? What are you, deliberately promoting or preparing for? So that could be providing people guidance, maybe supporting your more tech savvy users, those digital champions, and providing them guidance on how to get something out of these new features like Microsoft lists and columns and views and these things. Maybe you're helping them make some minor tweaks and sort of changes and clarifying the behavior of how things work. An obvious and really critical point is about ongoing training. So whether that is providing refresher training to people that were already trained at the beginning, or realistically catering for the fact that people will have left and then new people will have joined. So making sure that you're continuing to provide that training for people, and not just simply pointing them to the refresher videos, making sure that they get an opportunity to be trained appropriately as well. And then the
Yeah.
final point, Rupert, do you want to pick up on enhancements?
Yeah, I think this is the one which I probably see the most, which is so much you can do in SharePoint. you don't do it all on day one, right? And so the first thing is people get some success, get some confidence. They're like, well, actually, now I'd like to expand the scope of what we're using SharePoint to do. I want to keep that momentum up. And we're also trying to deal with that fear of many people saying, look, if I don't get my requirements in the first project, it will never happen, because that's when the budget gets shut off. So thinking about that and thinking about if you want to ring fence budget for a phase 2 might make some sense to you. The other thing is that when you design business processes and how they're going to be supported in SharePoint, you have to be cognizant of the fact that those business processes may change. Whether that's internal or external factors. But if those factors change, then we need to think about, well, how do we have to, how do we change and replicate those changes back into SharePoint so the system still reflects the new way of working. I think, Ben, the last point I want to go on to on maintaining SharePoint success is the proactive piece. So how can we make sure that we can save ourselves from any issues down the line? And I think there's a couple of things. I'm going to cover one. I'm going to pass the other one to you. The first one is that the Microsoft platform is changing. There's updates all the time. Gone are the days where you had an Office update every 3 years. We get new things every month, multiple things a month. And occasionally some things get taken away as well. And so being aware of those and what impact they may have is key. But I think the other thing about governance, Ben, we talked about maybe, that governance of processing, creating a new site. But what does governance look like on a sort of ongoing basis, on a maintenance basis?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's you've defined these templates, you define these structures. The governance is making sure that, as inevitably your SharePoint estate is going to grow, you're going to get more projects, you're going to have more data accumulate within your environment. The governance really is about keeping an eye on that, making sure that you're not running out of storage, for instance, making sure that you're not keeping data for any longer than you really need to. So being able to archive off projects, archive off, SharePoint sites where relevant, and keeping an eye on, maybe sites or teams that have become inactive over time and starting to question, are they actually still needed? Has the project come to an end, and does that need to be shut down and maybe information moved into a central repository that's available to certain people, for example? So it's ensuring that all of those good practices that you've defined to set up your structure, you're keeping that relevant and up to date, and you're ensuring that it's being adhered to.
And this is the kind of service that you can either maybe build yourself or lean on somebody else. We deliver this service for lots of clients across the UK, actually in the US as well, because they see the value in having an expert sort of giving that oversight. So if that is of interest, do get in touch with me. Now, Ben, when I bring all these points together and we kind of tackle them into an order where we hear them coming in a customer lifecycle and a customer journey, what does that look like in a process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, ultimately what we're trying to say here is do your planning, do your design, do your structure, and get all of that right first. So the first thing you've got to do is define that purpose. What are we trying to achieve? And then what is our governance plan going to be? Who are the roles and responsibilities that are going to maintain things? What are the type of templates? What are the structures that we're going to need? What are the use cases we're going to support? And what are the ones that we're, going to actively not support, for instance? Once you've got that, you can then start getting technical and looking at building structures, defining and setting up templates. And then, although we talked about, training happening before your migration weekend, you need to be planning your migration well in advance, because you need to be looking at the data and the structures and that information that needs to be brought over, and using that as an opportunity to maybe archive off data or even remove data that's no longer relevant. So yeah, you've got everything set up. You then start to plan your migration. 2 weeks before you're going live, you're getting your training and making sure everyone's trained, and then you've gone live and you're handing over into ongoing success to keep it fresh.
Perfect, Ben. So look, thank you for that summary and that run through today. This is obviously based on experience and all the things that you've seen. So hopefully that will help you a little bit too. If you'd like a further conversation about this with myself, do just jump on our website, and there's a big button saying book a call. If you click on that, it will drop straight into my diary. Happy just to have a conversation about what you're up against, what you're looking to solve, any questions that you might have. Otherwise, Ben, thank you again for your expertise. Super session, and looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, thanks, Rupert. See you next time.